Hi, everyone. Welcome to our virtual author series this evening. Thank you for supporting your locally owned independent bookstore in Books and Books. We're thrilled to be here and to be in partnership with Miami Book Fair and Culture Crusaders for this wonderful series of events. Tonight, we have the honor of hosting Paola Mendoza and Abby Sher to discuss their new novel, Sanctuary. Paola Mendoza is an author, film director, activist, and artist working at the leading edge of human rights. A co-founder of the Women's March, she served as its artistic director and co-authored the New York Times bestselling Together We Rise, behind the scenes at the protests heard around the world. Paola's film credits include the award-winning Entre Nos, Free Like the Birds, and Autumn's Eyes. Abby Sher is an award-winning writer and performer. She's the author of Miss You, Love You, Hate You, Bye, All the Ways the World Can End, Breaking Free, Amen, 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 Memoir of a Girl Who Couldn't Stop Praying, and Kissing Snowflakes. One of her essays was included in the first season of Amazon TV's Modern Love. Abby has written and performed for The Second City, Upright Citizens Brigade, HBO, and NPR. Tonight, Paola and Abby are going to tell us a little bit about their book, their process, and we'll follow that up with an audience Q&A. A quick guide to your screen. Below me, the green button will be there all night, is where you can purchase your own copy of Sanctuary. And then to the bottom right, the Ask a Question button is where what we're going to use for the Ask a Question portion. So as you come up with those, add them there, and we'll make sure they get asked before the night ends. So with that, I will hand it over to Paola and Abby for a bit, and see you later.
Hello.
Wow, that technology is amazing. Ooh, maybe not so amazing.
All right. I'm gonna try. Is it echoing for everybody now? Can anybody put a hands up if you can hear me? Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm not echoing.
You are echoing, but it's lovely.
Can anyone from Books and Books help us with some tech here?
Get audio, video help.
Hi, Paola. Can you try putting on some headphones?
Say again?
Can you put some headphones on? Some earbuds or anything?
Abby, why don't you start and I'll go deal with that.
Yeah. So welcome and thank you so much for having us. We are here tonight talking about this book. I'm so in love with the cover. The cover is the one thing that we had nothing to do with, except that we said that we loved it. So the cover was designed by a woman named Dana Ladle, and it's just dreamy. I love it. Sanctuary is a book that takes place in the near future, 2032 to be exact, and it tells the story of a young girl named Valentina. She's 16 years old, living in Vermont with her family, and the country has now devolved to a state where everyone is being chipped and anyone who is undocumented is being rounded up and taken away. And Valley and her family are now on the run. And it follows her journey across the country in this dystopian but all too possible world that she's living in. And it ultimately is about her journey to find sanctuary for her and her little brother, Ernie. And Paola and I started writing this in 2018. And maybe, Paola, you can speak to how the original gem of inspiration came about.
Let's test my sound.
Perfect.
Great. So actually, Abby, I think I'm hearing myself on you. Can you mute yourself? Yes. So now it's not echoing for me. So the original idea came in 2018. I was one of the organizers of Marches Against Family Separation. And for those that don't recall or need their memory jogged a little bit, which is what I need all the time, family separation was a policy that was implemented by Donald Trump in 2018 that stated that any children with their parents that cross the border into the United States illegally would be separated from their parents. And so that turned into thousands of children being separated from their parents, some as young as, I think the youngest was 8 months old, and placed in either temporary foster care, government run facilities that are basically detention centers, jails, and parents being lost from their children for months on end, given right now that it's been 2.5 years since that policy was first implemented, and there are still children that have not been reunited with their parents. So that, as a mother, as an artist, as an immigrant, as an activist that works in immigration, that was some of the most horrific months that I lived through. Obviously, it didn't happen to me, but in the bearing of witness of the horror that this policy was ripping apart families. So the positive thing in that moment is that it took about 6 weeks of pressure from the public, from the Democratic Party, from activists, from marches, outrage, for that policy to be stopped as we knew it. And so I started thinking to myself, that was a monumental task that we were able to stop family separation. But what would have happened if we wouldn't have done that? What would that horrible policy have allowed to continue to happen if we weren't able to stop it? How would that have emboldened the administration? How would that have emboldened Stephen Miller, who is the person that implemented who created the plan and implemented it? And I started to imagine the world of Sanctuary, which is a world that is very scary, that is very dark, that is violating individual rights and human rights left and right. It is a world that has an authoritarian regime and dictator at its center that is no longer trying to hide it, but is flamboyantly expressing his hunger and desire for absolute power. And the world was a pretty scary, horrific place. A world that I definitely don't want to live in, and a world that specifically any vulnerable community doesn't want to live in. So I then asked myself, what is the solution to this horrible world? How do we get ourselves out of this reality? And what came to me was Valley, a young, undocumented 16-year-old girl that has no initial interest or desire to essentially be a freedom fighter, but she steps into that role first to take care of herself and her family, and then she realizes that her own freedom is bound with the freedom of others. And then Abby and I got connected, and it was love at first sight, and we still love each other 2 years later. And we really started fleshing out who Valley was and who were the other characters and the world, and taking this seed of an idea and creating it into the book that is actually today. And I know that a lot of the questions that were asked are, how is it that we collaborated and how did we write together? I think in a lot of spaces we're able to understand possibly co-directors and other things, but the artistry of writing tends to be very solitary. So we're going to talk a little bit about our collaboration and the how, and I'll pass that over to Abby so she can inform us a little bit more, and then I'll jump in after her.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I would reiterate that this has been a really dreamy collaboration that we've that I came from a background of performing where I collaborated all the time, and then became a writer and was very solitary. And so when I was offered a chance to even meet Paola, I got very, very excited. I would dare say I tried to woo her. And when she told me about this project, I was immediately hooked. These were the days before COVID, if you can remember them. So we sat in the same room, and we were sometimes less than 6 feet apart. And we had a giant whiteboard where we would map out like how Valley could get from one place to another, what the year was. I feel like I've said this before. I feel like there's a lot of math figuring out if Trump did this now, then what would happen in 4 years, and what would happen 4 years after that, and a lot of arrows and squiggly lines. And we would do that for like 8 hours at a time, and then we would go home to our respective homes and start writing pieces of it and send it to each other. And I guess from a technology perspective, Google Docs was like immensely helpful because we could both be sharing ideas at the same time. I think it also was really helpful that we were diving into this world that we were essentially creating together and bouncing it off of each other, so that we could find both the truth of it and the hope of how they could get out of it. And it is a really hopeful story, it's about a revolutionary in the making. And I think it was very important for us to each be able to share that journey so that we could find her spirit of revolution.
I would add that in our collaboration, I've collaborated, my whole artistic career is with collaborators. I think that I am a better artist when I am collaborating. But I will say that all of my previous collaborations have been with people that I know really well, friends that have been friends for a long time. So there's a history there and a knowledge of knowing one another. In this scenario, I didn't know Abby at all. And so it was a big risk. And one that was really out of character, because one of the things that I am most protective about is the artistic process. But it was in meeting Abby and a guttural, instinctual message that was flashing saying, she's the one, she's the one, she's the one. And I've said this to Abby 1,000 times. I've said it publicly, privately, but Abby's collaboration has been one of the easiest collaborations that I've had. And I think that is because, I don't know, maybe it's because we didn't know each other beforehand. So there was still, at the beginning, there was that tentative dance of like, we're trying to know one another. We're on our best behavior because we're just dating. But it's also, we kind of gravitated, as Abby was mentioning, to our own personal strengths, and really trusted the other person in their strengths. And one of the things that is a really important foundation in collaboration that I've learned over the years is that when you're getting into creative battles, and those creative battles can be many or there can be few, you have to constantly be asking yourself, am I arguing this point? Am I debating this point? Do I believe this artistic choice because it is what is best for the art that we're working on? It is what is most truthful to the character, to the story, to the world? Or am I arguing this because it's personal, because I want to be right, because I want it this way? And that takes a lot of just self-awareness to have those honest conversations. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not. And so I can say that like the creative differences that we might have had along the way, and there weren't many to be honest, that was super clear to me that it wasn't really ever personal because possibly we didn't really know each other very well. So that's just like analysis that I've been thinking about with regards to the creative process.
I also, to add to that, I think that it was fascinating to see, to experience the way that you, Paola, create art, as opposed to I've been, I have usually written by myself, and to watch the creative process, and as you said, that it's hard not to be incredibly protective over the creative process. And this winds up being a story about like one person who believes she has to go at this alone and builds a community as she goes to find her way to freedom. And I think that the struggle that we have right now is, in COVID, in this current climate, is that there's such a disconnect between how alone we are and how together we are, and how are we going to affect this election, and how are we going to affect this world as individuals and as a community. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying, like, I know for sure I would not have been able to write this book on my own. It would have only come out of us being together.
Yeah, for sure. I agree 100%. I think we should go to those questions, Abby, or do you have something else before we jump into questions? All right, so this one got a vote up. Oh, sorry.
Want to read them? I was going to read them to you, but
okay, please do.
Okay. So the first one is, what made you decide to do a YA book instead of an adult book?
Well, as I was saying before, the answer for me was Valley. And Valley always was going to be a young undocumented girl. So I would say two things. One, when the idea of this book came about, there wasn't a lot of YA books that were about young undocumented girls, young undocumented boys, people. Just undocumented immigrants were not central to many books. There was just a few books. And for me, as an immigrant in this country, as a woman of color, representation matters. I grew up in this country not seeing my stories being told, not seeing my mother on TV. My mother was in movies, the character of my movie. The culture of where I lived wasn't present, and it made me feel invisible. It made me feel like I wasn't part of this country, which I think is the point and was by design. And so for me to realize that there was this glaring gap, that stories of young undocumented people were not being explored or celebrated as much as they should be, was a red flashing light to say, tell this story. Now, I am not undocumented, though I am an immigrant, and I felt that it was important to tell this story. And I think it's important that undocumented people tell their own stories as well. I don't think it's either or. I think it's an and. And I think that the beautiful thing is that 2 years later, when we put out Sanctuary, there's a handful of books, YA books in particular, that are dealing with undocumented immigrants at the center of their story. And to me, I think that's a beautiful, exciting, important development and evolution in the YA sphere. And we need more. And in order to get more, obviously publishers need to know that people want to read these stories. So that means that these books that have undocumented immigrants at their center need to be shared, purchased, explored, given to presents to people in your life. So that's one reason for me personally that we made the book YA. Abby, do you want to? I can talk forever, so I'm going to be quiet.
You can talk forever. We're still in our honeymoon phase, so you can always talk forever. I feel like, yeah, I have endeavored many times to write an adult book, and I often have churned out YA books. So I think I have always been of the mind that young adults are the people that I need to speak to, because as a young adult, I needed to read these stories. So I never read a story about an undocumented girl. I never even knew what that meant really as a young adult. And I think that young adult has come, as a terminology, has come to mean something very different now. Like, I think the book that we have written is intergenerational. It's definitely for 12 and up meaning to 92. Like, I think that it's I mean, a 93-year-old, I would let them read it, but I think it's meant to be shared, and I think it's meant to be discussed, and I think it's meant to be in schools and in homes and in family conversations, because young adult books are the way to open these conversations that are very, very hard to have with young adults. I have a blossoming tween right now, and I often think I will hand her a book about, puberty or mental illness or whatever it is that I'm having a hard time expressing to her, much, much quicker than I would sit down and say, hey, let's talk about this. And the fact is, we have to start talking about it. So this is the way to get these stories into everyone's lexicon. And also, I think that Valley herself is really indicative of so many people who are experiencing this. We have young adults who are being taken from their families, or not given a chance to be a child anymore. And they're being thrown into this position of having to fend for their worlds and their lives. And they're rising to the occasion. I mean, nobody should be put through that at any age. But honestly, young adults are the ones that are saving us right now in so many realms of this country.
I think kind of on the subject, I was asking, what do you guys think, or what are some things that teens who want to get involved, want to be active, on the forefront, I guess, of human rights activism? What are things that teenagers can be doing or can do now?
I would say that the beautiful thing about Gen Z is they are so more advanced culturally than millennials and Gen X and obviously boomers, and the conversations that have tripped up older generations for so long are less of an issue with Gen Z. And I think that is great, because they can be the cultural translators for those of us that don't understand where the world is trying to move. In the progressive, I believe the world is moving in a more progressive, inclusive, compassionate place. And so I think that the young people teenagers need to realize how important that role is, and that they are the only ones that can do that. So when your family member, your mom, your uncle, older cousin says something that is inappropriate, that you don't understand, that you don't believe in, and you have the experience to explain why, that is important. Maybe you haven't read all the books that gives you all the knowledge to be able to quote important scholars, Maybe you don't read the newspaper every day. Maybe you can't even vote. But the reality is that your lived experience as a Gen Z young person, teenager, is actually more important and more valid. And your true understanding of this world that we're trying to head into is something that needs to be shared with generations that are still confused by the shackles of the systematic racism, sexism that we have lived in our entire lives in this country. So that's one, and I think that that's really important to highlight and say how critical that power is, because it truly is power. 2, what Gen Z did on TikTok at Trump's Tulsa rally was extraordinary. And so, but that's exactly what I mean, right? That like these young people understand how to get shit done in a way that older generations cannot. And so I believe that you all have the answers that I can't even tell you what to do, because y'all are so brilliant and so creative that you all just need to go and do it. Because Gen Z uprooted that rally in such a way that he basically stopped having rallies, because he was doing Tulsa in the middle of pandemic. So he didn't stop because he was afraid of the pandemic. He was stopped, I believe, because young people were like, we're going to outsmart you every step of the way, because this whole internet thing is our life and we understand it better than all y'all. So I think that's really, really exciting. So I think to be able to do those things is incredible. Lastly, if you are 18, because I still think that 18-year-olds are teenagers, if you are 18 and able to vote, what we really need you to do is we need you to volunteer as a poll worker. Mostly it is elderly people that are poll workers that are working, and to be a poll worker is to be at the poll where people go and vote, and you help people go and vote, and you're there. It's a job. It's a very important job, but mostly it's old people. And we know that given we're going to be in the pandemic in November, it is a very dangerous job for elderly people to do. So if you are able, you still feel safe and interested, sign up to be a poll worker. You also get paid. It's a job. So you could go to powerthepolls.org and sign up to be a poll worker there. And voting is critical to human rights.
Awesome. So the next question is, how did you balance writing the gritty reality that undocumented people go through with having the strength to keep fighting when it seems too hard?
Do you want to take that, Abby?
Sure. Although I don't know that I have much of a balance to to tout. I think that writing a story that's emotionally true is draining, no matter what story it is. Obviously, I've never experienced the things that Valley has gone through, but researching, reading, listening to some recordings of people who are going through this. There's footage from inside detention centers, from people who are experiencing their losing their parents. Excuse me. It's heartbreaking, and I would definitely say that I had to do it like in small installments. But it was so necessary. And obviously it's nothing compared to what it is to experience this, to live it, to be still living it. We're still getting posts that say like, I never heard of this book, or I've never heard this kind of story. And that to me is heartbreaking, because it proves that the story needs to be told. So we had to get as gritty and as real as possible. And I remember a time when actually, Paola was suggesting a plot point, and I said that's too cruel. Like that just wouldn't happen. And then we literally got a news alert that it had just happened. So anything that seems, I hate to even use the word dystopian at this point, because I think it is so present, and I think it is so urgent that we do something about it. That if we shied away from that gritty reality, then we would be doing a disservice to what's going on.
And kind of like sister to that question is, what was your favorite part to write?
Well, before I answer that, I want to just piggyback on what Abby was saying, because I've been telling stories of immigrants for over 10 years, specifically undocumented immigrants, 2014, 2012, probably. So that means that I've listened to hundreds, if not thousands, of people's stories. And my work brings me to people when they are in very vulnerable positions, when they are forced to make decisions that will affect the trajectory of their whole lives. And I've had the great honor to have these people share their lives with me. And whether I'm making a movie or whether I'm doing a photo exhibit, a photo project, or anything in between, I've had to listen to the stories that are filled with unconditional love and so much dignity and power and inspiration, but also a lot of tragedy and pain and decisions that they are forced to make that are unfair and just unbearable. And so I've kept these stories inside of me for 10 plus years. And I've shared them when I've been able to. But it was in the actual writing of Sanctuary that I was able to use the stories that I had listened to and heard for so many years and put them down on paper. And not one character is based on one person that I've met or one incident directly related to a person that I met. But all the characters and all the moments and the plot points in this book are strands and elements from the hundreds and thousands of people that I've spoken to. And so it is all those moments that we wove into the 300 plus pages in the book. And so, to be honest, the writing of the book wasn't painful for me. It was actually very therapeutic, because I was able to put those stories that I've been holding on to onto the page. And so, it was just, I think art in many cases for artists can be extremely therapeutic, and at least for me, and it is why I always kind of go back to the same themes and stories, which is essentially love stories between mothers and their children. And it is because I have a lot of emotional, personal, but also just experiential stories to work out there. And as for my favorite part of writing the book, I'm going to pass that over to Abby, because my son's dinner just arrived and I have to go open the door, and I'll be back in 2 seconds.
I also want to speak about the therapeutic effects of it, and then I definitely want to touch on the most fun part. I think for any readers who are out there, it's incredibly therapeutic when a reader reaches out and says their feelings about the book. I write about many things that I'm too scared to say out loud. So, as I said, like mental illness, eating disorders, unspeakable horrors between people and the government. And I think that there is there's such a need to connect, because these are all things that people feel either isolated about or shameful about. And if we can make this process of finding hope and finding freedom more of a collective experience, then that is the point of writing this story. And in terms of a happy moment, I don't want to give anything away in the book, but there is a moment in the book where Valley's little brother, who's 8 and is also fleeing for safety, and she's in charge of him, and it's horrible to try to explain to an 8-year-old what is going on, or try to not explain to them what's going on but keep them safe. And both Paola and I have 8 and 9-year-old boys. And so there's a moment where Ernie, the little boy, gets to do something just for the sheer fun of it. And he just enjoys himself in the midst of all this chaos and cruelty. And I loved writing that scene.
Awesome. So should I ask? I'll ask a new. Oh, she's back. Okay, awesome. So next question is, if there are any authors, books, or stories that you guys would point to as storytellers and as creators as being really fundamental to sort of how you became storytellers.
That's a great question. So I didn't grow up reading books. My mom was an immigrant mother who had to focus with putting food on our table, a house over our head, and she herself has pretty severe learning disabilities. So she was not a reader, didn't enjoy books, and didn't necessarily pass that love on to me. So I will say that one of the first novels that I read was when I was 14. And I actually don't even remember how it got to me, but it is a book called The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende. And to me, that book was a personal revolution because, again, going back to this idea of representation, I saw myself reflected in a story. I saw the character of my grandmother. I saw while I'm not Chilean, I'm Colombian, there's overlap in culture, and I felt that family that she talked about, the magical realism that is in the book. There is a brujeria and a magicalness in the culture that I come from. All of my aunts and uncles, they all have their own brujas and brujos that they go to, and like I grew up very much with that, and ghosts all over. And so seeing that made me excited to read because I felt seen. And then I think it's really telling that, that book is about the Chilean Revolution. That is about when Pinochet comes into power and what a family does and how family fights back against an authoritarian regime. At the age of 14, I didn't know what the trajectory of my life would be, but I was also very intrigued and interested and became obsessed because of that book around Chilean history and that specific time period. 1973, when Ajay is overturned, he's killed, he's murdered because of the coup that was backed by the United States. And it's actually September 11th, 1973. And the trajectory of that country totally changes and really influences all of Latin America as well. Because they being the United States, didn't allow a socialist president to succeed who was elected into office. And if he would have succeeded, it would have changed the face of the politics of Latin America. That's why Chile is so important to the history of the United States. Anyways, so I would say that book,
it's a great book,
was extremely influential. And then I would say more recently, to what influenced me personally here with Sanctuary is Hunger Games, which I hadn't read until we started working on Sanctuary, and then Octavia Butler. If you don't know who Octavia Butler is, all of her amazing work, you need to read her work because she was incredibly influential personally in the creative process of this book.
Abby, do you want to share?
I was looking up to see, actually, I think my best friend got to narrate House of Spirits, so I was trying to give her a plug. Yeah, I think I had a mom who went to the opposite extreme, where she read, I wanted to read whatever she read, and she was really into Jane Austen. And I could not sit through one book of it. I literally had to do a report, and she was so upset that she went and got me the video. Don't do that, but if you have a report, you should really read it. But anyway, but then I think the book for me was Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. And I'm trying to remember when, I think that was in college that I picked that up. And also Lucy by Jamaica Kincaid. And it was like these voices that I felt totally like the world had just been blasted open, that there was a new way of expressing language, expressing emotion, expressing truth. And I became fascinated with both of them as authors. And I also think that as we started delving into this world, I had not written futuristic dystopian before, and I also really did enjoy the Hunger Games. Octavia Butler, the Parable of the Sower, and The Giver. I loved The Giver.
Have you guys read anything lately, like any new releases this year that you recommend our readers?
Well, since my mic is already on, I'll jump in. This summer, I just finished Homegoing, and I love that, by Yagi Alcee, and I know she has a new one coming out.
Yeah, I think it might have come out Tuesday. Transcendent Kingdom.
Yes.
Already came out. Yeah, they came out.
I'm very excited for that.
I will say that the pandemic I think there's been kind of two roads people have taken in the pandemic with regards to reading. Some folks have been able to dive into books and just read. And then others, like myself, have found it very difficult to concentrate and read an entire book and read a book. And that's really sad for me, because I would say that since I was 14, since I read my first novel, that's actually never happened to me. I'm always reading a book or two books. So that being said, what I decided to try and do was to not explore new writers at this moment, but really go to writers who I know and love, and try and read books that I know that I love, because it might help me in my inability to concentrate. So that being said, I'm currently reading Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon. And it's slow going for me, but whenever I am able to get in and read a good amount of pages, it feels so good. And she's masterful, and there's just no words to describe how good she actually is.
So I think we'll wrap it up here, but I want to thank you guys so much for partnering with us on this event. We really appreciate your support. We're so excited about the book. For everyone watching, again, that green button, even if you watch this back tomorrow or later, it'll still be there. It'll still bring you to purchase a copy of Sanctuary for yourself. So thanks to everyone who joined us. Thank you again, Paola and Abby, for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.